All right, thank you guys again so much for coming. Absolute delight to see all of you. It is totally my pleasure and my privilege to introduce to you these two exceptional artists who are on the stage with us. I'm going to start with Quetzal Flores. Quetzal, a Chicano musician, producer, and cultural strategist and organizer raised in East Los Angeles. He is the founder and musical director of the Grammy Award-winning Chicano band Quetzal. From the experiences generated through his family, mentors, and the Chicano arts and cultural community, he has participated in multiple moments of radical transformation. We're really excited to hear from him, as well as artist, scholar, producer extraordinaire Alex Chávez, who is the Nancy O'Neill Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. His research explores articulations of Latinx sounds and aurality in relation to race, placemaking, expressive culture, and the intimacies that bind lives across physical and cultural borders. He's the author of the multi-award-winning book Sounds of Crossing, Music, Migration, and the Aural Poetics of Huapango Arribeño, recipient of the Alan Merriam Prize from the Society of Ethnomusicology. In 2016, he produced the Smithsonian Folkways album Serrano de Corazon, Highlander at Heart. He's consistently crossed the boundary between performer and ethnographer in the realms of both academic research and publicly engaged work as an artist and producer, so perfect for this convening. Chávez has recorded and toured with his own music projects, composed documentary scores, served as creative consultant for feature films and stage performances, and collaborated with Grammy Award-winning and Grammy Award-nominated artists. So clearly he gets a lot of sleep, right? So today we are going to be hearing music and being in dialogue about this phenomenal, absolutely gorgeous forthcoming album, Sonorous Present, which is an immersive, poetic, and musical passage that extends sonic meditations on loss, migration, and memory across America's borderlands as physical place and liminal space. So please join me in welcoming Alex and Quetzal, who are going to kick it off with some music.
Yeah, definitely. Mil gracias. So first, buenas noches, good evening. There you go, yeah. Thank you to John and Aaron for the gracious invitation and to, engage with all this wonderful scholars and community around these, I think, really important and pressing ideas. So I do want to start with some music, and before we do, I just want to share something kind of by way of introduction, which I know we'll get to a bit later with respect to this music and how it, in particular this project, how it ended up becoming what it is, right? Because it was very unanticipated. I didn't set out to like make a record, but here we are, and it exists, and it's out in the world, or will be soon. But it's sort of out in kind of our own kind of space of creation and being able to share it in these moments. But a lot of it was animated, it seemed to me, at both Quetzal and me, like by mourning and grief. So, when you're mourning, a lot of it, things don't really seem quite what they are. And oftentimes it's because you're having to hold space for other people, right? And you have to sort of hold it together. And so, sometimes you have to find space elsewhere to mourn. And for me, it was through songwriting, through making music, holding that kind of space elsewhere. And so what became this album, Sonorous Present, is this sort of suite of compositions that honors a number of people that I've lost. And so I often share that, this music, it's a meditation, it is a eulogy, it's an apology, it's a conversation, it's a provocation, it's a fiction, it's a testimonio, it's a memoir, it's a confession, it's an offering, it's an attempt, it's an urge, it's an inclination, and it is a center for me. It is an edge, to invoke the language from before, it is also a border. And if we think about that, it's also a break. And so I can't invoke that word and not think about Fred Moten and this sort of holding space for where we might construct other possible worlds, and oftentimes that happens through art. In some ways, this whole convening takes that kind of idea to heart. And so I do believe that art can take up the call to elevate the seemingly ordinary, like mourning and grief. All those moments when we feel the lump in the back of your throat. And it's a bit tough, right? And I think, truth be told, we're all going to be touched by this. This is just kind of where we live. I think a lot of us most recently were touched by this in the context of COVID, right? This is a moment we have not processed. There is a sort of heaviness and grief to that we have not really thought through. And so, and not to mention certainly the now of mourning when we think about Palestine, Haiti, the Sudan, the Congo, etc. So for me, this music was a way of crafting through that grief around the loss of my mother, father, sister. And I'm very honest about this. Like, these songs, they broke my heart trying to write them, right? So, but I do believe that we need to dwell on heartache sometimes, because I think it does open up the kind of the space, the capacity for a space for healing. And so when we've been sharing this music, we tell people that we want to invite you into this space, into the break, to meditate, to mourn or celebrate, whatever it may be. Okay, so we'll play this first tune, and then kind of open it up for a little bit of discussion. But it's called La Bruma, which is translated into the mist, and it's a song that kind of invokes son, but goes a little bit outside of that too. So yeah. Gracias.
Just gorgeous.
Thank you. That was pretty short, but on the record, I don't sing it. We had Quetzal's son, Sandino, who's amazingly talented, sing it. So I'd written this, and I was like, well, trying to reimagine it, and so I was asking if anybody wanted. Sandino gave it a shot, and I was like, wow, it's amazing. So he does an amazing job. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so many things that I want to ask you about. I'm sure lots of folks want to ask you about, collaboration, process, composition. But I'd love to take it back. You started off with, your own meditation on loss and on grief to frame the sonorous present. But in a conversation that we had last week, you had also mentioned that part of this conceptually has some roots in your first book.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So maybe could you walk us through, because you have such an illustrious musical career, right, as a performer, but you're also a very, very accomplished scholar. So can you walk us through completing Sounds of Crossing,
sure,
arriving at this pandemic moment, and connecting the concepts from the book to the form of this record?
That's great. Yeah. So, like I mentioned before, I didn't set out to make a record necessarily, but so with the book, I had the opportunity to travel quite a bit and sort of give lectures and talks around it. And one iteration of it involved performance, very much like this. It was just me and speaking about the book. Reading a bit and sharing some poetry and music. And then I had this sort of thought of maybe wanting to grow it into an ensemble, and so I enlisted a number of folks that live in Chicago, a bunch of folks there who are both these, in my opinion, luminaries in the world of both Mexican son and jazz there in the city. And so I put together this ensemble, and we did it. And it was great, and people really responded. So it's kind of like, what's a different way to extend the life of the book in other spaces? And so it was through performance, through music, clearly, right? So, and so I was inspired by that, and applied to grants and all the rest, and got some support to do it. Then COVID happens, and we can't perform live. Nobody's performing live, right? It's impossible. So I knew at some point I wanted to make a record, I guess, with these ideas in mind, but really not knowing what that would be. And so what I did was I called Quetzal. I was like, hey man, look, here's the situation. I basically relayed all of this. So here's the situation, but because I knew that if I was going to skip the step of growing something in a live context where you get to really dig into to the language we were using earlier, really into the process. Why I wasn't going to have that. So it's like, well, then I'm not really interested in just going into the studio and documenting what I just did live once. That would be really unfair, I think, to what this, could be. So it's like, well, then you have to bring in someone outside of yourself to help you do that. And so we would, a producer, right? So, and I thought of Quetzal immediately because we speak the same languages with respect to, traditional music, particularly Mexican traditional music, and we always sort of are trying to push beyond the horizons of what that is or what that means, and also coming from this, sort of world of kind of intellectual engagement, activism, all the rest, and so, yeah, I called him up and I was like, hey, so I guess the only step to do now is, I guess, try to make a record. I don't know. And he was like, yeah, let's do it right away. And so we spent a couple of years in between Chicago and here, making a record. And it's interesting too, if you see all the footage and the pictures, particularly when we're in Chicago, like everybody's masked up. There's no vaccine, there's nothing, right? But everybody's testing, and we're trying to be responsible about it. But trying to come together to do this, and it ended up being very collaborative. But I think for me, what it sort of evidences in terms of the concept of like extending the life of the book into something else, just like the Folkways project, but here something far more personal, was, and it made a lot of sense in that time, was to try to think with this notion of kind of gatherings of intensity. And sensing bodies. And, COVID's so strange, right? It's like, this sort of social distancing, but we're like, the kind of lack of intimacy and all the rest. But this sort of notion where the kind of sonorous might surge and roll, right? And so the way I thought about it, which I write about in the book, but was present as the sort of the intensity of the moment, right? And it's saturated with sound, and whether it's poetics or music, etc., but then also as a gift. So as present as, so that was kind of where we landed, but I didn't anticipate that it would be what it became, to be honest with you. I was kind of along for the ride with Quetzal. It was just really a wonderful collaborator.
Yeah. And often isn't it the case that some of the most magical ideas visit us by way of accident, right? In a lot of cases, unfortunately, visit us by way of catastrophe, and so we have to make out of that kind of necessity, right? Just partially because of the theme of what we're doing here these next 2 days, I want to ask you just one more question about this connection, right, between your work as a scholar and your life as a musician, and I hope over the course of the next 2 days that binary gets disrupted. Please, right? But all of us who have any kind of relationship to the Academy have some kind of relationship to method, right? Methodology. So for you, you've been trained in a lot of different ways, but your post at Notre Dame is as an anthropologist. Mm-hmm. And key flagship methodology, of course, is ethnography. And so I'm wondering how, in your work as a musician and in your work as a scholar, e.g. as a writer of scholarship in our logocentric universe, how you've thought about ethnography and how you've made that method do different kinds of work for you.
Yeah, so it's interesting, like so some of the material that ended up being on this record are there's songs that I was writing at the time when I was initially doing field work for what became Sounds of Crossing. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have an outlet to, just a different way of writing that experience was like, writing a song, that's sort of adjacent to that world of experience, I suppose. And in some of that, to go back to what I was sort of mentioning before, was around mourning and loss, because it was right around that time my mother had passed. And so there's this, connection to Mexico and migration and borders in her life, and the kind of, in some ways, the tragic nature, particularly of her as a child, and all these things sort of coming up, and how do you recognize that story and it becomes legible in the people that you are working with, right, your interlocutors. And sometimes, doing the thing, the kind of scriptocentric thing is not enough. It does a certain kind of work, but I felt like, so I was writing music quite a bit. And so engaging, I guess, what people might call ethnographic songwriting, or this multimodal ethnography, right? But I don't know if I thought about it that way, but I think now I maybe have language around it because we talk about these things now. But as I've come to realize, like, what I was doing then and what I've continued to do, and in some ways that has fed into what this project became, was this sense of getting beyond the kind of script-centric notion of doing ethnography, right, the sort of rendering at play, but also expanding kind of our notions of what ethnographic processes should look like. So like, or scholarship, right? An album can be scholarship, right? So, you know, a song can be that, right? And also vice versa, right? Like, well, your book, you know, like what you're writing can also sort of be aesthetic, be art, right? So, but, and sort of crafting through notions of grief. So I mentioned that too. I keep returning to that one because the context of COVID in which we were trying to finish this thing, but also my father passed during the making of this, and so there's these things, right? It's like crafting through that grief in a way that was grounded in sort of lived experience that I can't untether from, you know, or I couldn't, right? These larger questions I'm always asking about embodiment and sound and borders and migration and race and immigration and all the rest, right? So, and for me, getting at that, I guess, as a form of another kind of ethnographic kind of modality, I suppose, was not just something that was like, oh, I'm going to write a song or whatever, like that's important, but to me it's like, I'm going to write, but pull on these threads that are of sort of artistic work that are rooted in collective practices. So like what you just saw us do right now. Right, so we're playing these instruments, we're part of this particular tradition that we both know and we sort of have studied and all the rest, right? But how do we, you know, use them to meet our own needs? Which is what people do all the time, right? This is nothing new, right? But like how to, so but immediately to me it's like, oh, I'm connected to something else. And how is that story connected to something else, right? So there's that, and in some ways that kind of a return to this question of rhythm and epistemology, right? Because when we think about quote unquote tradition, which is always the kind of balance between maintenance and innovation, right? But like these sort of cultural forms that are indebted to some sort of historical antecedent, that they carry memory, they carry, and a lot of that is through the practice, through the embodied doing of it, right? Which is what? It's just an equally valid and important site and process of knowledge production. And in some cases through rhythm, right? So, you know, so to me, that was a big component of it. So like that, drawing on those things, how that feeds into trying to tell a story, trying to process, but then also, you know, how might I think about that ethnographically? I think that I'll return. We have language to think about that now, I suppose, but like I don't know if I necessarily thought about it in that way initially, but I feel like I can describe it that way now. Mm-hmm. But I think that is kind of what it is, I suppose.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, often with so many things. I mean, it's our bodies know before our words do.
Totally. Right.
Our bodies know before we have the apparatuses, especially in more traditional forms of scholarship. To legitimate in the eyes of the academy the things that we are making, right? Knowing, of course, that these institutions were not built with us in mind historically.
Yeah.
Going back to something we were talking about at that on the opening remarks, thinking across scales. One thing I really love about your work and about this project is the ways that it foregrounds different types of rhythms, literal and metaphorical, right? The rhythms of grieving, right? The rhythm of loss, revisiting that loss over and over again, carrying loss with you into a sonorous present, right? You mentioned just a moment ago, tradition, Mexican son music. If folks are familiar with your work, you might also know Alex from Los Santos, right? Which is amazing, genreless group that is just nothing but energy. So I'm curious about, and especially on this record, which will come out later this year. There are so many different rhythms that index so many different traditions,
sure.
Right? There is the Mexican son, there is things that you could categorize as quote-unquote jazz, right?
Sure,
We all can hopefully problematize that category. Mm-hmm. And other things too, right? The rhythms of Roger Reeves's poetry, which is also featured on the record.
Yeah.
So, as a composer, on the one hand, you have the traditions that you have learned that you in some ways feel indebted to Mexican son, and also the relative openness of so-called jazz music. How do you think, in maybe using some songs as examples, how do you think about either combining or oscillating, right, merging these languages?
Sure. Yeah, I was very specific, but in some ways kind of very open to just seeing where things went, because the people so Quetzal and I got together and we sort of laid the foundation with respect to what's kind of material we want to work with in terms of compositions, I suppose. But then you have to bring them to life, because it's not just us two in the studio just doing the thing. It's like, okay, well, I hear X instrument or X voice or whatever, so we enlisted different people to like come in and provide their perspective and their art and their creativity to the project, such that that was a very specific decision to be made around like who do I hear on this song or doing this on this set of songs, but also leaving it open to the fact that, well, they're going to do what they're going to do, and we have to be like just open to that and embrace that, because that's why we're trying to do that. So I'll give you two great examples. So there's, in my mind, he's an amazing kind of luminary there in Chicago. His name is Matt Eulery. He's upright bassist, jazz guy, but really crosses the line between jazz and classical music. He's a composer, arranger. I'm a huge fan of his. I love his music. And I know him, we're not great friends or anything, but I know him, and I was like, hey, like, I came to him with this. I was like, hey, would you play on the record, and would you do some string arrangements? He's like, yeah, got it. And so I was like, but I want you to do you. Like, don't listen to, like, this is a thing, but imagine this is your composition. What would you do with that? And he like, the lump in the throat. When I heard it back, I was like, oh my God. I was like, he did the thing that I feel like that's why I asked him to do that. So like, that's a good example. Or the other major voice that's featured on the record is Laura Cambron, who's she split her time between Chicago and LA. Wonderful singer. She does a lot of traditional Mexican music, from son to ranchera, and she's a friend, but we never really collaborated together. But I heard her voice. I was like, there's some of these things I want you to sing. I want you to sing with me, and some of these things I just want you to sing them, if you'd be open to it. And she did, and she brought that energy, and she in terms of, and it sort of indexes, right, the kind of the traditions she's sort of in. But she's doing something else, and I know Quetzal can speak to this, but like, so those are good examples of like, these are friends and people that we know, and that I, at least for me, wanted to collaborate with, or at least was just a sort of a fan of. As I'm trying to bring this music to life, I was like, well, who would I want to, if I were on stage, who would I want to be next to me playing this music? So these are the people, right? And another person, like for instance, that Quetzal brought in was Aloe Black, who dear friend of Quetzal, and people don't know, he's half Panamanian, so he speaks Spanish, but he's never sang in Spanish. So like, here we are. Like, I was like, well, would you be into doing the song? He's like, yeah, I'd love to. So we and I don't know if it was conscious in terms of like, oh, we want to get someone who does this genre or this genre to do that, but it was more like, who are people that we would want to just be on the record, and like just collaborate with. And it ends up, you end up referencing these styles, like, oh, well, you've got Laura, who's like singing kind of in a son style with like, Eulery or Nick Mazzarella or Chad McCullough, who are like playing jazz. Like, I just sort of happened that way, but it was more about like trying to reach out to people that we felt we wanted to play with. And I guess I'll end with this, that like, and maybe you had a question about Roger, but like Roger Reeves is a good example of this. So I don't know if you know who he is, but Roger Reeves, incredible poet. He's a professor, now a full professor, apparently as of like a couple weeks ago, at the University of Texas at Austin, English. Won the Kingsley Tufts Prize. He's a Guggenheim Fellow. I've known him for years. He's a dear friend, and we've collaborated on stage in the past. Actually with Los Santos, where we were like just vamping out a cumbia, and he gets on stage and just like off the dome just does spoken word. So we've done this before, and then I knew I wanted some sense of narrative beyond lyrics on the record, but I didn't want it to be me. I want somebody else to do that. And so I called him and I was like, hey, would you? He's like, of course. And so he came to Chicago, and some of the stuff he wrote beforehand in conversation with me about, like, well, what's this song or idea about? He wrote to that. And then some things he just did in the studio while we were kind of tracking things, and he just got inspired, and we're like, just go, do what you, like, what speaks to you.
And I think this parade of courses says a lot about you and the openness that you bring. And so just to mark that, I think, again, this is a very special gathering of people. And we're very lucky that we had you come over here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. So before we bring Quetzal out and have a question for him and turn it over for some more live music, you brought some stuff to share with us.
Sure, yeah. I think there's another image here, right? Okay, yeah. So this is, it's in Mexico. It's at San Luis de la Paz. It's a town in the central part of San Luis Potosí. No, excuse me, not San Luis de la Paz, El Refugio, sorry. It's where I was living for a year right before, my mother had passed, etc. And so, to Quetzal's credit, he could talk about this a little more. But one of the things that we did on the record, instead of like talking about a place and being quite literal about it, we incorporated field recordings of mine into the composition itself. So one of them was actually me walking on one of these roads that then becomes part of the rhythmic foundation. So we can play a little bit of that field recording, and then maybe start the actual song where you can hear that same field recording, and then you hear Roger over it, which is kind of lovely. So this is me leading a topada, an all-night performance at about 6 in the morning. And the music's still going. It goes on like this is like a 10-minute long field recording. Right? We didn't use all of that, but then we used part of it, and then we began to sort of loop this, and you'll hear kind of what happens here. And this begins in the same way, but then you'll hear Roger. We can listen to him a little bit.
His mother refuses to rise from her bed, so he cannot sleep in his. The road welcomes his dawn, wandering without judgment or hesitation, something almost near nonchalance. Unlike the birds, tanager, golden-faced and brown-eyed warbler, ash-throated flycatcher, cave swallow, committed, they burst through the morning's thick gray wall as if they refused the binding of the book of birds that sits on his mother's shelf and have torn themselves from its pages. Left the book on the floor and searched the morning for a grain of sound, what they had lost all those years ago when they were bound to the book's rough pages. Wildly, wildly they arc and call as if they too belong to grief, and wildly living through it, living with it before it arrives. He listens for accusation, but only hears birds, which is accusation enough. The morning beneath and around him, and the rooster not coming in through a window. Even the rooster's red crowing wanders, sorrows, drunk, lost in a bed of dust that is, at once, as wide as night and as narrow as a foot. Of course the day would not be decent to a man who could not overcome a closed door, the light brushing the floor beneath it. The lamb's bleat is an escape, another way out that's also a way in. He's in the house, watching his mother's mouth work against the past while walking on this road. The present is too much with him.
Actually, guitar too is actually a sample of an aunt of mine who's also passed. It was during an interview and she pulled out a guitar. She just started showing me kind of licks and stuff. And we sort of put her there, kind of like a bird also, right? So that piece Roger wrote, I gave him the field recording and he knew the song that I wanted to sort of anticipate it. So his piece sort of ties that together. If you want to do one more, we can, and then we can, yeah. Yeah, so there's, I think, this other picture here. Yeah, so that's one of the places I did a lot of work in, Hichu, Guanajuato. It's up in the mountains. Every year they have a big festival of Huapango to ring in the new year. It begins at midnight and it lasts till noon the next day. And this music, for those of you who don't know, the context of it is this traditional Mexican music, but it's centered around two kind of opposed dueling ensembles that engage in musical and poetic flighting for 10, 12 hours. And they're kind of perched atop these benches, and the dancing public is in between. So to ring in the new year, there are thousands of people that show up. So many New Year, I was there doing field work and recording and all the rest. Oftentimes, you know, there's something about that music. You sort of, I mean, to speak, and at least for me very personally, not quite, you know, analytically, but you kind of get in a trance because, you know, particularly the violins that are playing all these figures that repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, and you're sort of, and if you've been up all night, like, it's just so you get into a kind of a space, and so sometimes you get surprised and when there's like, a kind of a moment where people, you know, sort of shift a bit in terms of what they're doing. And I've recorded many of those moments, and so there was one in particular that I decided that I ended up using, and I had asked the ensemble that was playing the main person there, Don Guillermo, who I've done a lot of work with, if I could use it to put in the composition. And so I think we can play. What you'll hear first is a bit of like what the actual recording is. And this is like, this is like at 7 in the morning after being up all night, and then it'll pause, and then you'll hear kind of what we did to it. We looped it and pitched it and set it to a particular BPM so that we could like compose to it. pitched it a little bit, sped it up a tiny bit, and there it is, right? And so this, if we want to play the song itself, so then we took that and wrote to it. Behind that was so many times I've been in Hichu, you know, you're there all night. And it's one of those situations where, you know, all night and then you sort of get tired, but you stay up, and then right before you know it, there's sort of this deep mauve in the sky like a blanket, and you're like, oh, the sun's gonna come up, and then all of a sudden the sun is up. And you've been dancing, it's like 10 a.m., and it's noon, and you're like, oh, I've been here like 12 hours. But so I had this idea of like, what would the sun say to you as it's coming up, right? So Serenatas de Milagro de Regalo, right? I'm gifting you serenades of miracles, right? That are painted in lovely yellow colors, etc. So like this notion, so being blessed by the sun is sort of the kind of the topic of that one. And the person here they're singing is Laura Gambro, who's like, I love her voice. Beautiful.
We are all in for a treat when this record drops later this year. My God. At this point, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I'd love to bring Quetzal back out. I have one question for you, Quetzal, and then I will kick it over to you for some more music. So you've known Alex for a while now. You've been collaborating together in a lot of different contexts. What was it like for you to work with him on this particular project?
So yeah, we've known each other for decades, just to say. And we've been threatening to work together for that long. And to have seen each other on tour, like passing each other on tour, performances together, going to see each other's shows, whatnot. Like there's a long relationship here and a lot of admiration and respect. And so when he called me, I was like, yes, absolutely, 100%, let's do it. I've been waiting for this, right? There's a couple of musicians in my life that I felt this way about. And it's so funny because the last 2 years, it's happened, right? And so for me, it was just another moment for me to delve into my bucket list. And then, like Alex mentioned a second ago, there's a lot of convergence in terms of our development as musicians, the things that we like, the music we like, our sensibilities around music, our love for traditional music, but also our love for, you know, a number of styles of music, and our love of psychedelia, you know. Not the drugs, but you know, the things that, you know, sounds psychedelic. And so, you know, and then there was the aspect of the death of his mother, you know, and and me being very tuned to grief and the need to grieve and the need to heal. right? And to hold these processes. And if you think about this, like, as a nation, if you want to call it that, right? Country or whatever it is, we've never grieved the genocide that happened here. We've never grieved slavery. We've never grieved, that genocide as well of all those people that were lost in the Middle Passage. We've never grieved any of this collectively. We're not allowed to, right? There is no mobility when it comes to those questions. As a matter of fact, there is like moves to shut those conversations down, right? Like we're all seeing on these campuses today. And so, when someone comes to me, and also I'm steeped in restorative reformative justice practices and blah, 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 right? And so when someone comes to me and says something like that, I pay attention, right? I'm like, oh, and then this is my homie, this is my close homie, so I'm like, let's do it. And wouldn't it be beautiful to do it through music? And so for me, it was, there are many layers, many levels to it, and I see it as part of my greater work.
Amazing. We are so lucky to have these two gentlemen here with us. Let's kick it over to you guys to play some tunes.
Sure. And I also just want to mention too, like some of this, I always love hearing get some talk, man. It's like, but so like this idea, for instance, of even something as that incorporating field recordings, that kind of thing, like that never occurred to me. Like how to take that and make it part of the composition. And that was all Quetzal. He was like, yeah, field recordings. Yes, I have too many field recordings, man. Like, he's like, well, you were like, well, pick some out that you think they're special to you for some, or that sort of whatever, right? That are, that you find meaningful for some reason. And the story behind them. And so those are two examples of how that happened. And it was a way of bringing the listener into that world without being at least literal, right? Like, I'm not going to write a song about El Refugio San Luis Potosí. Like, no, I'm going to bring you there through the sort of the soundscape. And that was, Quetzal, suggesting that. And to his point as well, yeah, just so you all know, that, Quetzal is, what if the band Quetzal, we just celebrated 30 years here in East LA, a bastion, yes please, of music from Los Angeles, and who I consider as part of this deep history and kind of family and community of music from LA that is like incredibly important, and that is, again, in terms of steeped in notions of social justice, transformative justice, that has always been, at least for me, a point of reference, a beacon in terms of what are the possibilities of like art, and in terms of political transformation, and so yeah, of course he was the first person I called, and I felt really kind of blessed that we've been on this journey together now, after sort of being kind of ships in the night a little bit with some of this stuff. So, and actually, if I see, yeah. So we'll play two songs and then we'll kind of wrap it up. But
Can I say one more thing?
of course,
Sorry, yeah, okay. So there's also this thing called Chicano music, okay? It's about 100 years old. Okay, and the way I would describe it is the way that people from our community articulate our lived reality through song, music, dance is also incorporated. And I have to say that this practice does not exist without Black people, okay? Black music, it is absolutely a part of our lived reality. We live in community with these people, and have parallel experiences, and sometimes the same experience. And so within the album, you hear a bunch of diasporic drums, including the tarima, the stomp box that we utilize in our tradition. We play and bata drums, congas, cajon, there's a bunch of stuff, right? And that these things come from these incredible, this is not George Lips's, but he does use this, irrefusable of an unlivable destiny, right? And think about how much it took for those people to carry these things across space and time to land in our hands, to land in our toolkits, in our resource buckets, to be able to fight back, to be able to feel human and to help other people feel human. And so Chicano music has this incredible thing, and who knows the song La Bamba? Yeah, the 1959 recording of Richie Valens. Los Lobos did it again, they did a great job. But let's talk about Richie Valens for a second. Okay, what was happening during that time? Well, you had Operation Wetback. You had, it was still Jim Crow. It was still like this moment, right? And this little 17-year-old kid from Coima could have done whatever he wanted to do. And instead he decided to record this song and reaffirm an identity, reaffirm a humanity that had been taken from him. They made him change his name. They made him, do all these things so he could be palatable to a white audience. And so what seems like maybe like a cute or curious or curiosity is actually an act of rebellion and something that meant so much for people in my community at that moment, And I get so emotional because of what's happening right now. It's really painful to watch. But,
well, in that spirit of sort of struggle, some of that history you mentioned, this picture here is of an uncle of mine, my tío Adrián, who's there, and who was not a musician himself, but was a bracero worker for many years. I wrote this song for him. It's called Dirty Hands. Las manos de Adriana no dejan de trabajar, construye y cosecha, quehaceres sin demorar, por la noche sueña el viento y el ancho mar. Sueña que sus manos son alas para volar. Abraza los cielos que no quiere despertar. Abraza los cielos, se cansa de trabajar. Recuerdos y amores viven en sus dedos, suenan como cuerdas, cantan de sus hechos, sus callos guitarras y sus uñas versos. Compone canciones, Adrián de sus tiempos le canta a los cielos que no quiere despertar, le canta a los cielos, se cansa de trabajar. Artifacts. I dug down in her purse for answers with my hands. sunglasses, chewing gum, Tylenol, cell phone, cash, ID. I dug down to keep busy with my hands. The medical examiner held up her autopsy photo, and I refused to look. So I dug with my hands to keep busy. And all these years later, I can't recall. In her purse, was there a photo of me? She phoned me prior to her trip. I didn't answer. She left a message. She was heading to Chihuahua, and she arrived there, and she died alone. And in that moment, I thought, when it was ending, as she approached the light, what flashed through her mind? What memory? What prayer? What reflex? Her hands. What did she reach out for? Would the Tylenol save her? The cell phone? No sense in calling me. I wouldn't have answered. Gracias. This next song is called Cómplices de Luto, Accomplices in Mourning. gracias. Thank you.
Give it up again for these two. My God. So we have about 15 minutes before we're wrapping up for the first day. So we'd love to invite you guys to pose your own questions to Quetzal and Alex. I'm sure that there are many. And you can either belt it or we can pass the mic around, whatever works for you guys. Yeah, Michael.
Please, yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, incredible music, and it's great to hear it juxtaposed with your thinking. I wanted to ask about the second piece you played, the recording that had the sampled video recording, and I wanted to ask about reincarnation, and if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of metaphysical things that can happen in the compositional process that is specifically sonic. Because it reminded me, you mentioned psychedelia, it reminded me of Alice Coltrane's work, which is, it's not using field recording, but it's using like intense, tape splices that recall her late husband's music and transcribe and replay her late husband's music in ways that are kind of thinking about time and memory in a very deliberate way that is, using hallucination. And I don't know if that's just some of the things that were happening for me when listening. I just didn't know if it related to the way you were thinking about composition.
Well, you were already working with it with the Sonorous part, right?
Yeah. Reincarnation. Well, I certainly believe that in our DNA, we're carrying information, we're carrying pieces of our ancestors. And in that way, certain things resonate in certain ways. I know when my son was really young and he would get frustrated or cry, he would put his hand right here. And I used to do that when I was a kid. He never saw me do that, but, and so we can assume that this has been passed down, and maybe there's a trauma involved in it. Who knows, right? There's tons of possibilities. But certainly within remaining open to those channels, to our ancestors and to that information and how that information connects, across realms, let's call it. I feel like there was certainly a guided process beyond just what he and I were, physically doing in that room and present, our bodies present in that room. There was something else happening there, and we felt it, and we let it happen. We allowed ourselves to be those channels. And that's oftentimes what you do as an artist is you're simply a channel, and you're pulling from all these different things, and you're very sensitive and you're sensible. So you're allowing yourself to feel these things so that you're able to articulate them in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that.
I've learned over time, like making music with people and collaborating, is that just being open to that, precisely what Quetzal is speaking to, but also, being open to just that, which sounds kind of obvious, but just to that sort of spirit of collaborating. And one thing that I've learned over time is like nothing is precious. So I might bring a thing, the idea, or whatever it is, or the thought, or the sort of, but it's like, it's going to become something else, and you have to be open to that, particularly if you're really in the spirit of collaborating with people, like, what are they going to do? It's going to transform. And so, whereas years ago, maybe, I didn't understand that, I feel like I've arrived, as of late, a while now, where like, I love letting go, because I think those channels can be open in ways that you don't even anticipate. So, so that field recording, well, first of all, having Quetzal say like, okay, let's take some sounds and see how we might reimagine them and how they might be part of a composition. I never thought about that. and bringing that world is sort of reincarnating, my experience. I mean, that's a field recording from 2007. That's almost 20 years ago, okay? To this moment in time, I've been the only one who's ever heard this, right? And this space and that time and what that meant to me to now see it take on another life is special and important. But then not only that, in the collaborative creative process, to then have someone like Roger write to that, and imagine a story that's about my mother, it's my hair stand up, right? And to be open to that and to those channels, I would never have anticipated that. And I think to reimagine the life of something was just a very special thing that we got to do, and in some ways really steeped in that process of wanting to create together, and those sounds and that rhythm to think about of my footsteps as being the foundation for that. Because what you hear in the recording, what becomes the actual song, is the entire time we loop my footsteps. There's a particular moment into like a 4-bar phrase, and that's what you hear the whole time. And it's actually a sample that we bring back in the record later. The depth of that, I don't think is something that I would have imagined when I took that walk at 6 a.m. and whenever it was, in May of 2007 in El Refugio San Luis Potosí, right? Here we are. And in a way that's connecting also, just to conclude here, even what you hear in the offing at the beginning, those musicians, that's a kind of the end of the arc of that performance. They've been doing that for about 10 hours. And they're like, okay, we're getting done. Right. And I'm leaving, but they're still sort of there. And then to hear like they're about to go to bed, and you hear the rest of the kind of the space come to life, right? The birds and all the rest, right? This moment of transformation, of how that moment of performance now is sort of reincarnate in something else. At least for me, I'm leaving, I'm going somewhere else, right? But it arrives here, and there was something special about that. And I don't know if I thought about it in those terms, but it gets out being open to those channels of how things are coming to you, I suppose, was something that we really we really embraced, I think. Yeah.
More questions? Oscar.
When you were talking about Qigong music and relationship with the Black experience, it made me think about the roots of Sonorous, right? And which are part African.
Absolutely. Yeah, so these instruments here, they come from a tradition called Sunkarocho, and more specifically, a communal practice that gives birth over to this tradition called the Fandango. And Fandango is a Bantu word that means celebration on top of a platform, right? And that's exactly what that Fandango is. It's like you have this wooden platform, and you have dancers that are coming off, and there's this whole protocol, and you have these concentric circles of musicians who are playing the music, and then there's this whole verse thing, and there's a whole trajectory that begins with a song where you introduce yourself, and then it goes all the way into the night, and there's these existential songs like Cascabel, and then you have the morning songs, like, okay, what's the animal that would bring the morning? I'm asking. Rooster. There's a song called El Gallo, and the verse says, Arreador de las Puranas, mayoral de la luz nueva, llave sonora que hilvana, canto que se eleva para abrirnos la mañana. And there's this, so it's like this beautiful and very indigenous, and when I say indigenous, I mean African too, way of being connected to the earth and nature in these profound ways. And so the son are these pathways back towards it, right? And the process of really going through, and just like the topada that Alex mentioned in the tradition that he has really studied and researched, this thing lasts all night, right? And it's a ritual ceremony. And so, and that it was also at some point outlawed because, Black and indigenous people created this thing, or Black indigenous people created this thing, right? And so it was threatening, and it was liberating, and it was all these things that, you know, that we need as people to feel that connection, to feel that belonging, to remind ourselves how we can move forward, how we can find mobility in the face of brutal confinement, and so on and so forth, right? And this has been going on. And so these traditions emerge from that, and now, you know, like these traditions exist in the urban setting, and they take on these other meanings, and there's new verses that you put to it, because you don't necessarily sing about the Huacamaya, the macabre in the middle of the forest, because you don't know anything about forest, not the city, right? So I know about the concrete forest, and so then you start writing these verses that have these other meanings here, but you're still pulling on nature, you're still pulling on those ideas, and so it's a really beautiful tradition, a powerful tradition, and it's been very useful in building communities. And in particular here in LA, we have a project called Huapango, and it's the interfacing of West African, particularly Ghanaian, drumming and dance traditions, and that community of people with the Obon community, which is the Japanese American circle dancing, and then the Huapango community, which is, you know, the participatory music. So they're all participatory practices, and we come together every year, and we have this thing where we do each other's dances and practices, and you know, and then there was, before the pandemic, there was an encuentro, like a day of like dialogue and, you know, and sort of strategizing around like, how are we going to mend these fractures? Like, you know, I grew up in movement, and I watched, you know, Black and Asian and Chicano people work together in these very incredible ways, and to build these incredible things. And then here comes Reagan, you know, and two terms of Reagan, and then Bush, and, you know, and the whole thing, and there's like these massive fractures. And then the whole like Clinton era and what that brought for so many of us. And, you know, and now we're at this point again where we're trying to find each other, and we're like, you know, and then at the same time, you have these young people that have figured out this other thing, and that we can probably learn a lot from, right? But we're all trying to do these things, and we're all trying to build and create these intergenerational spaces where we can actually be community again, and be connected to one another.
We have time for one more question, Maya.
Thanks so much. I just want to say it's such a thrill to hear and see this presentation. And for me in particular, I grew up in the Bay Area in a musicians community that the musicians that I was learning from really looked up to Quetzal. We used to see right up in the Cultural Center in Oakland. It's like seeing my friend you now. And one of the things that I was taught to admire about Quetzal was precisely the way in which these kind of counter-hegemonic rhythmic forms that are in the folkloric music, it's specifically in the folkloric dimensions, being connected with political consciousness. And I was, just because we're talking about rhythm today, one of the things that stood out to me, the first song we played, in the traditional strumming style, there's that more elongated strumming. And I'm wondering if there's connections there between that style and what Natalie said about the clave, a moment of an engagement with Black rhythmic form that is kind of there but then disappears. And so is that strumming style a juncture for those types of issues?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's part of like syncopating, right?
Right.
And that's totally where it comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we connected first through the kind of jarocho and huapango kind of practice, and so kind of, and I always say, like, I'm perpetually a student of those musics, you know, in terms of the history and as a practitioner and all the rest. But, you know, how do you learn and honor tradition and practice while at the same time understand it has to serve other needs, right? Because, so I think particularly what Quetzal as a band have done, and you know, not just as a band, but rather also within the purview of this much broader kind of what people would call the movimiento jaranero, which is a sort of, which goes back or decades, you know, but like to think about this specific moment in the 90s when Quetzal and other musicians, Chicano musicians, are connecting, interfacing with traditional musicians from Veracruz, right? That, you know, creates this moment that, you know, produces all these spaces where a lot of young people till today are playing son jarocho and using it as a, you know, as a tool for organizing or doing participatory sort of practice in politics all over the U.S. I mean, we can, and that's some ways how we came together, came to sort of know each other, and to kind of, you know, be there, do that, and then work on something where like, it's a couple of anecdotes. Like, we know how to do the thing, yes, okay, and we love it, but we're always like, let's try to reimagine things because that's just it's what we do as artists, right? And so like, it was just funny. Like we were like once like, can we like not put any jarana on any of this? You know, like so like we would resist. We'd be like because it's so like well it's at hand. We could totally. We're like, let's not do that. Let's just kind of. What we would normally play on there, how might we reimagine it like on a Roland Juno 106, right? Or on guitar, or on that, right? Like, so let's do that. So it's there, the current is there, but it's like not as obvious. And it's a kind of in the spirit of like honoring tradition in our own way, right? Which has its own kinds of politics. And another kind of anecdote too is like there are no drums on this record. Well, in terms of like a trap set, what we ended up doing, because we wanted that affect, but we were like, what's another way to again bring another world rhythmically that could achieve that, but is not that? So what we did is we sampled Marta Gonzalez, his partner. Most of the percussion you hear is her on the tarima. Her footsteps, there's some bata drumming and some congas, but like if you hear stuff that you might think is like this thick backbeat, you know, it's like, no, it's her on the tarima, stomping. And so we use that as a way to like kind of ground ourselves and again, utilize all these elements and sort of, you know, try to, I don't know, just kind of in the spirit of being adventurous and trusting each other and the people that we were working with to try to just create, you know, but yeah.
The rhythms of history, rhythms of recollection, collaboration, expansive solidarity, mourning,
Definitely.
and joy in the face of so much, so often. Thank you so much for giving us a lot to think about and so much to feel.
Thank you.
We will be here tomorrow. Another amazing lineup of folks. Please be safe getting home. And Aaron, do you have something that you want to add? Oh, 10 a.m. tomorrow, right? Thank you guys so much. Be safe.
When's the record coming out?
Yeah, the record will be out in October, mid-October. There will be like a big lead up to it, different singles and stuff like that. And we're planning to do a big release show here in LA on the weekend of Dia de los Muertos. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This is my mother. Yes, I didn't mention that. Yeah, this is. Let's see if I look like her. Yes, María del Refugio. That's her. So that last song, Cómplices del Luto, is sort of this notion of accomplices in mourning is sort of a conversation I'm having with her. Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. Yeah, I forgot to mention that.